Former U.S. President Donald Trump has been indicted by a grand jury in New York after an investigation into alleged hush money payments made by his former lawyer to an adult film star. This is said to have happened just before the 2016 presidential election. It would be the first time a former U.S. president has been charged with a crime. Kristen Salumi begins our coverage from New York.
Adult film star Stormy Daniels and her alleged sexual encounter with Donald Trump is at the center of the criminal case against the former president. After she threatened to go public about the affair in the final days of Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, Trump's then fixer, Michael Cohen, paid her $130,000 to keep quiet. Cohen, who testified before the grand jury, has said he made the payment at Trump's direction and in 2018 pleaded guilty to violating campaign finance laws, for which he served time in prison.
It's not revenge, right? What this is about accountability. I don't want to see anyone, including Donald Trump, indicted, prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated, simply because I fundamentally disagree with them. This is all about accountability. He needs to be held accountable for his dirty deeds.
The former president has always denied the affair. He also initially denied any knowledge of the payment, but now says it took place as a legitimate legal expense.
Did you know about the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels?
Under New York law, it is the falsification of business records, not the payment itself, that would be Trump's crime, a misdemeanor. And only if prosecutors can prove he made the payment and falsified records specifically to hide the affairs from voters or the IRS would it be a felony or more serious crime that could come with jail time.
The falsification of records for the purpose of committing tax evasion would be the additional specific crime to elevate falsification of business records from a misdemeanor to a felony. So he needs something like that.
Complicating any prosecution, Cohen's former legal advisor, a Trump ally, told the grand jury Cohen couldn't be trusted.
No, listen, if they want to go after Donald Trump and they have solid evidence, so be it. But Michael Cohen is far from solid evidence.
President Trump has described this case as a witch hunt, but it's far from the only criminal investigation he's facing. In Georgia, prosecutors are looking into his alleged attempt to overturn Joe Biden's victory in the state in 2020. And several government bodies are investigating his alleged role in the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. The case marks the first time in history that a U.S. president has faced criminal charges. Kristen Salumi, Al Jazeera, New York.
Well, Donald Trump has himself reacted. In a statement, he called the indictment political persecution and election interference at the highest level in history. He blamed it on what he called radical left Democrats engaged in a witch hunt to destroy the Make America Great Again movement. And he said this witch hunt will backfire massively on Joe Biden. Well, Mike Hanna joins us live now from Washington, D.C. So, Mike, fast-moving developments with this. What's the very latest you can tell us?
Yes, indeed. Well, you mentioned the piece on his social media page that Donald Trump has just written. Among those many sentences as well, he said that this is an attack on our country, the likes of which has never been seen before. It's likewise an ongoing attack on our free and fair elections. Now, to put this into a context, yesterday, 24 hours ago, on exactly the same social media page, Donald Trump wrote, "I have gained such respect for this grand jury and perhaps even the grand jury system as a whole." So 24 hours is a long time because the grand jury has now indicted Donald Trump, despite the fact that he had gained such respect for it. What happens next? Well, the indictment will be served on Donald Trump's lawyers. He will then be given the option to surrender to a Manhattan court Or if he doesn't, he could well be arrested. But then you've got a situation, if Trump remains in Florida as he is at present, there has to be an extradition deal done by New York with the state of Florida. So there's a lot of aspects in sight here. Trump's lawyers have indicated that he may surrender. He may appear in that Manhattan court. What will then happen is that he will be fingerprinted, he'll be processed, his photo will be taken, and then the formal charges will be laid. And it's probably only at that point that we will know exactly what these charges are. At the moment, all we know from many media reports and from Trump's lawyers themselves is that the grand jury has agreed on an indictment. The content of this indictment, the nature of the charges, not known at present.
And Mike, where does this leave Trump then in terms of the, running for president?
Well, it's a major issue. There's two sides to look at it. Donald Trump himself appears to relish the possibility of fighting a campaign with these charges hanging over his head. We've already seen in recent days him attempting to get his supporters out onto the street, as he put it, because of these pending charges, announcing prematurely that the indictment had been issued, even though it had not at that particular point in time. But then, of course, his detractors would argue that this just points to his failures as a person and that he would not get the vote should he stand in that ongoing 24 election. I must add as well that should he be convicted or even put into prison, that does not prevent him from running for the presidency. This is a particular quirk in the United States. You can't vote if you're a felon or if you're in prison. However, you can run for president because the Constitution doesn't say anything about convicted felons not being able to run for president. In fact, there have been at least 2 occasions in the past where somebody in prison has attempted a presidential race. That is an extreme supposition. That's an extreme case, obviously. We don't know what the charges are. We don't know what a sentence would be should he be found guilty of those charges. Those are all factors that need to play out in the weeks and months ahead.
Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C., thank you. Well, staying with this now, let's bring in Adolfo Franco. He's a lawyer and a Republican strategist. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to the programme. So, firstly, what do you make of the fact that this has actually happened? It's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is extraordinary, but it's an extraordinarily sad day for the country. Overall, despite one's views one way or the other of Donald Trump, this is entering new territory for the United States, and it is, depending on your point of view, and I certainly have one, political persecution. And when you have that sense in America, it's a first. So it's extraordinary. I actually thought it might not happen, considering some of the late developments in terms of the grand jury deliberations of last week and Mr. Cohen's testimony and so forth. It seemed to have a pause, but it was otherwise.
Donald Trump can still stand in the presidential election, as we've heard. Does that work for him or against him in the eyes of voters?
Well, I think certainly we'll see how this plays out. We haven't seen the details of the indictment, but certainly in the short term, it has already paid dividends since President Trump announced a couple of weeks ago that he was on the verge of being indicted. So it's very clear that this will further help him in the primary. There's no question. I can't imagine any of the few declared Republican primary candidates for president that will not come to his defense, as well as the ones that are undeclared, Governor DeSantis, former Vice President Pence, and others. Already the Republican reaction has been very, very strong, much more strong than the Democrat reaction so far. This is being outrageous and calling for congressional investigations and labeling it a political persecution in the country entering into a stage of becoming really a banana republic.
Where does this leave his rivals there, as you mentioned, for the Republican nomination? It puts him in an awkward position, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It already was very difficult for any of the credible candidates or possible candidates for the Republican nomination in 2024 already had difficulties distinguishing themselves from President Trump. They have been approaching this gingerly, a little bit on the age issue and that type of thing. But they all support the Trump policies. So it was always already a difficult task. Now you have political martyrdom in many ways. on the Republican side. I'm talking about Republican primary voters. So it becomes very, very difficult for them. They have to support and will support President Trump in this process, at least initially as it plays out. Longer term, we shall see if potential Republican candidates can start to say, although this is unfortunate, it will cost us in the general with independents, and try to persuade hardcore Trump supporters to switch allegiance only to win the general election. But that's very, very difficult to do.
OK, now many Democrats and some Republicans might say, look, this reveals a poor character, lack of humility. You know, Trump is a loser. He lost the election. Why would you want him to be the candidate with all this extra baggage going on?
Well, there are a couple of things going on in the country. First of all, and I think the opinion polls show it, when you have a president at 38 in one poll, 38% approval rating, and the vice president at 36% approval rating, and 64% of the American people saying that President Biden shouldn't run for re-election, you have a weak president. There's no question. So there's a vacuum. So there's a yearning for the Trump years. Those were actually very good years in terms of the prosperity, the economy. We were at peace. That agenda was working for most Americans. So there's that contrast that President Biden can't run away from his record. Why President Trump is because of that. He has a 4-year record. People attack Donald Trump, the person, the behavior, etc. But the policies are enormously popular with the American people. And again, you might have some appeal with other candidates saying they'll pursue Trump policies, but there's a fear there's only one genuine Donald Trump. And therefore, I think he will garner support among Republicans and possibly among independents and Democrats if this indictment and eventually whatever trial or whatever ensues next, if it falls apart, it will then be perceived as political persecution and could really put him in a position to win the White House in 2024.
Adolfo Franco, we'll leave it there. We very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's speak to Gabriel Elizondo, who's outside the Manhattan District Attorney's office in New York. So what's happening where you are now, then?
Well, we're waiting. We're waiting to see if we're going to hear any statement from Alvin Bragg, the district attorney here in Manhattan, or if we will actually get to see that indictment that apparently was signed by the grand jury. Why haven't we seen it yet? And that's because it's under seal. And that's normal under grand jury procedures such as this. Whenever the grand jury issues an indictment, that indictment does not go out in a press release immediately. It does not immediately public information. It would entail District Attorney Alvin Bragg to ask a judge to unseal that and make it public. And as of now, that has not happened. So what are we waiting for now here outside the Manhattan DA's office is we're waiting for eventually Donald Trump to arrive here to potentially be arraigned. That is the next step. When could that happen? Anytime, really. Normally in proceedings like this, after someone is indicted, the district attorney will call that person's lawyer, advise them that they were indicted, and then they will make an arrangement or go into negotiations about when that person that was indicted would arrive here to have their first court appearance. That could be potentially as early as tonight or tomorrow or within the next couple days. We simply don't know right now. Why we don't know a lot of information is because this is very much a private matter. And when I mean private, I mean it is not public. This is not held in open court. This is a grand jury that is everything is done in secret. So we're waiting here to see if we can get more information from the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, but he's under no obligation to give more information at this point. It's just a matter of if he chooses to at this juncture or not.
And at some point, I mean, how likely are we to see Donald Trump in handcuffs or anything like that? Or is that not likely to happen? Doesn't quite work like that in these kind of cases?
Normally under indictments, someone would come in, and it's called a procedure. You know, Donald Trump has come out and said, I'm going to be arrested. He has said, I will, you know, there's Trump supporters saying he is going to be put in handcuffs. Not necessarily the case. This is unprecedented, of course, but I can tell you normally in grand jury proceedings like this, when someone is indicted, assuming the person is willing to come to the courthouse, give their fingerprints, and do an arraignment, which Donald Trump and his lawyers said that he would be prepared to do, they would not necessarily be put in handcuffs. Unlikely we'll see him in handcuffs, but of course these are very unprecedented times. But normally in a grand jury indictment like this, white collar situation, crime such as this, alleged crime such as this, you would not see Donald Trump in handcuffs. Nevertheless, Donald Trump is certainly a showman, and he wants to make this part of his campaign going forward because he has said he views this as political persecution. We know Donald Trump, of course, he is a showman. So there is certainly a lot of people commenting and speculating that he will want to arrive here at this courthouse to show that he is, in his words, being politically persecuted. And so we just have to simply wait and see. There is a huge security apparatus that is taking place right now in Lower Manhattan, where I'm at right now, between the Secret Service, the FBI, and the New York Police Department. There are helicopters buzzing up above, as you might be able to hear right now. They are preparing to make this as secure as a handover, if you will, as possible when Donald Trump potentially arrives here. Will he go through the front door? Will they drive him to an underground parking lot? Will they take him through a back door? Will Donald Trump demand to go out to the front steps of the DA's office and give a press conference? We just do not know right now, and that is the big uncertainty. I should say, the normal procedure here under grand jury indictments is the person, in this case Donald Trump, would arrive here at the DA's office, would go into the DA's office, would give fingerprints, take a mugshot, a photograph. After that procedure is done, the next step would be they walk down a hallway for their first court arraignment with a judge. They would be arraigned in front of a judge, be told of their rights and the grand jury indictment against them, and then they would be free to leave. That is the normal procedure, and that could happen as early as Friday, we think. But again, this is an arrangement. This is a negotiation between the district attorney's office, the judge, and Donald Trump's lawyers moving forward. But at some point, Donald Trump will have to be arraigned in front of a judge and or his lawyers.
Gabriel, for now, thank you for that. Other news now. A court in Russia has ordered the detention of a U.S. journalist on espionage charges. Ivan Gershkovich works for the Wall Street Journal. He'll be held for 2 months in pre-trial detention. He told the court he was not guilty. The Wall Street Journal says it's worried for his safety. Gershkovich was initially detained in the city of Yekaterinburg and then brought to Moscow. The White House says all U.S. citizens in Russia should leave immediately.
These espionage charges are ridiculous. The targeting of American citizens by Russian government is unacceptable. We condemn the detention of Mr. Gershkovich in the strongest terms. We also condemn the Russian government's continued targeting and repression of journalists.
Rosalind Jordan has more from the State Department in Washington, D.C. on the U.S. government's action plan.
Well, the first priority, according to the principal deputy spokesperson, Vedant Patel, is for the U.S. Embassy in Moscow to gain consular access to Mr. Gershkovich. This is something that is guaranteed by international treaty, but as we have seen in the recent case of the WNBA player Brittany Griner, it was very difficult for consular officials to get to see Ms. Griner while she was being held in prison for the better part of a year. It's also been very difficult for U.S. officials to meet with Paul Whelan, the former Marine who had been convicted of espionage and is being held for 16 years in a Russian prison. So that is the first priority. It is worth pointing out that Gershkovich was detained while he was on a reporting trip to Yekaterinburg, about 1,600 kilometers east of Moscow, and the consulate there was not informed that he had been detained until he turned up on Thursday. Now, it's also a question, and officials at the State Department and at the White House don't want to answer this question: will Evan Gershkovich be considered wrongfully detained? That's an added layer of urgency to an American's case when that person is being held by a foreign government for whatever reason. And certainly being charged with espionage is perhaps a much more serious charge in terms of diplomatic relations than in the case of Brittany Griner being found with a small amount of hashish in her traveling luggage.
Now, we're just going to go back to our top story of Donald Trump's indictment and speak to Gabriel Elizondo again, who's outside the Manhattan District Attorney's office in New York. We understand you have some new information.
Yeah, just within the last minute and a half or so, we have just gotten official confirmation from the Manhattan District Attorney's office. It's a brief statement, and I'm just going to read it word for word. It says, "This evening, we contacted Mr. Trump's attorney to coordinate his surrender to the Manhattan DA's office for arraignment on a Supreme Court indictment, which remains under seal. Guidance will be provided when the arraignment date is selected." So that is official confirmation from the Manhattan District Attorney's office that the indictment has been handed down against Donald Trump. They have advised Mr. Trump's lawyers, and that the official indictment, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago to you, is under seal, which means it has not yet been made public, the official indictment. And then, of course, guidance will be provided when the arraignment date is selected. That would be the date when Donald Trump needs to appear here and be arraigned in front of a judge and also give fingerprints and a photo to the Manhattan District Attorney's office. So this statement, the first full confirmation from the Manhattan District Attorney's office that Donald J. Trump has been indicted by a Manhattan grand jury. Historic, because as we've been reporting, of course, this Donald Trump now becomes the first U.S. president in history to ever be indicted for criminal charges. Now, it's important to point out, and this cannot be said enough, an indictment is not, I repeat, is not necessarily a conviction. What an indictment is, it's a group of 23 grand jurors, these are regular citizens, that were presented evidence from the Manhattan DA and said that there is enough evidence that Donald Trump, in this case, should go to trial for his alleged crimes. That is an indictment. He will now, potentially now, the next step is go to trial, and that is where a jury will decide if he's guilty or not guilty.
Gabriel Elizondo with that breaking update. Thank you.